There she is. I'm, of course, your host, Drew Douglas, and let's get into it. So, Duncan, thank you for driving all the way from Guelph.
Hey, no problem.
In the rain.
Yeah. No, I've driven on that highway, I want to say, for probably like 2 months of my life, like cumulative. So I'm fine with it, honestly. It's all good.
Did you drive out for the series when you came, or were you in Toronto at the time?
I was living in Oakville at the time, so still a bit of a drive, but not quite Kitchener.
Mm.
So.
Have you ever done any poetry shows or any poetry communities in Oakville or in Guelph?
Oakville doesn't have a lot going on, at least not for people younger than like 40 or 45. Guelph, I know they do a ton of like poetry and art stuff. Closest thing I've done there though is like stand-up, which like there's a ton of like underground stand-up in Guelph, which is kind of cool.
I would have never expected stand-up. I think that's really cool. Do you do stand-up?
It's something I've wanted to do. I've done improv classes, but like probably like 5 or 6 years ago at this point. It's one of those things that you think, yeah, like how hard could it be? And then you think about just trying to tell jokes in front of like family at dinner, and like you've got to fill like 30 seconds, and then you think about, you know, even like a short stand-up set is like 5 minutes. So I think I just like collapse on stage or something at this point.
Well, you haven't clapped on stage yet. You actually did really well. I think it was our second show.
It was one of our early ones, for sure.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember which one it was now. But those first shows had a ton of people out, which was great.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I as soon as I saw it, it seemed like the sort of thing that I would love to do, but I sort of placed above my skill level, so I'm glad I got the chance to try it out.
That's really cool. What did you do to prepare yourself for reading?
Well, one of the things that kind of freaked me out is that I'm not a poet, right? And I think most of the people that read that night were poets, and I think about half of them read poems about wrestling, which was awesome. So I felt like, you know, you can read a poem and you can do it like with a lot of energy and passion, and there's a lot of emotion that goes in behind it. And when I read fiction, or at least when I write fiction, it's like I'm a hermit and I stay in my room, I shut off the lights, and I just sit there for like, you know, an hour at a time basically. And it's so much more solitary, and it doesn't seem like it has the same sort of energy. So I tried to practice, like, you know, speaking with enthusiasm, like enunciating, passion, but when you're going up against wrestlers, you know, you're not going to come up on top.
That's really interesting. Would you say that you notice the energy a lot in your work as far as having a certain energy put into the work being expressed when you read it?
Well, it doesn't always work. Something I've always been a little self-conscious about, actually, is whether or not, you know, what I put into it is actually what someone would read from it. Because I try to spend a lot of time crafting like atmosphere and voice, and you know, half the time the characters come out sounding like me anyway, so it doesn't always work. But I'm not a terribly like energetic person. Like I try to be kind of calm all the time. So to go from that, and you know, if the characters tend to have a bit of that, even if you don't intend it, to go up on stage and try to make it something different can be a little tough.
That's interesting. I would say, like, as far as that energy level difference, your story did seem to have very diverse characters as far as not seeming like you and also not seeming like each other.
That's good.
I think another benefit you get from reading aloud, it's one thing AJ kind of touched on, but you have kind of control over the pace, or you have control over the voice. Like when I'm reading something, I can kind of put whatever I want into it or change the pace however I'd like, but when you're reading aloud, you have control of the audience. How do you find that kind of audience dialogue, or do you find any kind of audience dialogue?
I like it. I've done more like public speaking for like nonfiction stuff than I have for fiction. For example, maybe five years ago, I did. York University does an independent TED conference, like a TEDx conference, TEDx York U, and I got in and did a TED talk for like this little salon event. So it was kind of a more intimate setting. It's just a polite way of saying I didn't make the main stage production. They just put us in a smaller room. And I read this essay I had written about love, and I think it was titled "Why I Will Never Fall in Love." And it was this big thing about, you know, love being a choice, and how we think about love is often very different from how you need to express it. And I think I talked about like The Bachelor for a bit of it too. And so I got in there, and it's something I feel kind of passionate about, but I pretty sure I just bombed. You know, like it was just like super stale. It was my first time really doing anything that I cared about. Like I can do public speaking and talk about, you know, like Model United Nations or something. That has zero impact on my life. But this was my first time trying to present what I thought was like a novel idea, and it just like bombed. But so that helped teach me like how to engage, how to read body language, like really suited to the individual audience. I don't know if it actually works, but you know, I like to think it's been at least better.
I think that's one of the unfair advantages extroverts get in the poetry world, because I remember a series recently, there was one person that's so used to being up on stage and so used to engaging the crowds. Like as soon as up there, they're joking, and like after every poem, like people are clapping and losing it, and like. And then there's another person, very good poet, definitely introverted, and they read, and people know it's good. They just don't know, like, if someone doesn't clap before me, I don't know to clap, so no one claps. Yeah. And once it doesn't happen for one, you can't clap for the second one, because like someone's already decided not to clap. So like, if you clap this time, it makes it seem like the first one didn't deserve it. Yeah. And you can get some of these poets that are very good, very talented, very powerful, and no one reacts, and they're stuck left thinking like, oh, I definitely bombed that, and you're stuck thinking like, oh, like this person's really good. Like I wish there was some way to express that.
Just like signs or something, you know, like a number. Like this was an 8.
Yeah. Toronto is also like one of the only places that doesn't snap in their like poetry community. Like it happens in slam cultures and all other poetry cultures, like most other cities I've been to, but not in Toronto.
Not Toronto.
And so like those ones that are like, you know, they're more serious, but they express something quieter or less less intense as those other poets. And so you snap for it, and it appreciates it. You don't have to be like super excited and screaming at it, but you snap.
I never knew that actually happened.
Totally
I've seen it in like TV shows or something, but I never knew people actually did that.
It's super awkward as well, unless you're a poet and you're like, oh, I know what this means. If you come into it, you're like, why are these people doing this?
It's kind of a level of like owning it as a poet. It's like making your own patch for a punk jacket if you're a punk. Like,
exactly.
I came into it thinking like this is just a stereotype or joke about these people, and then like people started snapping like, okay, like this is weird for me.
Yeah.
And then I slowly got like it's a way of not interrupting a performance but showing appreciation, and you can have more range of expression with it than you can with just a simple clap. But it was still weird. Like it was still a thing that I found a little off, just for my experience. How do you find it in places like Guelph? Like, if you've been there before, do people snap in Guelph, or do they?
I mean, I was in the only big event I've been to was like an underground stand-up comedy event, and it was in what felt like an attic of an old business building, and they stuffed like maybe 80 people in a room. They had a bar set up behind what felt like just like an office desk, and it was probably like 150 degrees in there. And people they didn't snap, but they just like lost it all the time. It was probably because it was like 11 o'clock at night by that point. People are kind of wasted.
Loopy.
To the point where the headliner got on stage, and it's a guy they bust in from, I think, like Hamilton. And he couldn't get through his set because someone was there for like a bachelorette party, except it was a dude. And whenever the comedian started to like engage with him to figure out who this guy was, his explanations for who he was with were just like completely incoherent. It's like someone was his girlfriend, but he was also living with this person and maybe married to another one. And it was just like I had no idea what was happening at that point.
I feel like he's really just setting him up for a heckle, and you really just gotta knock it off the plate.
Yeah, you gotta say something, right? Or at least be coherent. So yeah, that dragged on for like 5 minutes. So, but the audience there was it wasn't snapping. It was just like losing it all the time. It's just fun too.
Yeah, no, it's that'd be fun. There's actually a small place called The Corner at John and King. It's like a very tiny comedy bar. It's like maybe a 15-person room. But I've been there a few times. It's really nice. They do comedy every night of the week, and you get a really good community there, and they're all really funny, and they're all pretty nice people. And one thing I found really interesting is when I would mention like, oh yeah, like I'm part of a kind of creative arts series. A lot of them are like kind of standoffish, like, oh, is it like poetry and stuff? Like they just don't know if they can be in that space.
Yeah.
And it's so weird that these people are like stand up and comedy, like they're both on a stage, they're both presenting to people, they're both trying to communicate something to an audience. But
often very personal parts of their lives trying to communicate. It's just one's through humor and one's through poetry. And we've had both. We had like Brolin Devine, shout out to Brolin, doing both in one set, right? Like doing a stand-ups and reading his fiction, and it worked wonderfully.
Check the link below for Brolin Devine.
Yeah, we will Brolin. But if you go, like we go to Comedy Bar all the time as well, and always think, yeah, absolutely these could cross over onto our stage. Shout out to Comedy Bar, they're great as well. But yeah, it could totally happen, and it's a great community with tons of energy and feedback, and it could work. It could totally.
Yeah. That's the sort of thing I've always wanted to like cause, like that sort of reaction. And then I think about the steps I take to actually get there. It's like that might not be my style, you know. Yeah. Like I grew up playing music and like classical music and jazz and stuff, which means I'm not overly nervous on stage, but it also means I'm used to having something in between me and the audience, like I'm expressing myself through something else. And I realize that's kind of the case with like poetry and fiction, but it's obviously very different. Like you're not physically changing it through an instrument. It's just, it feels like it's just you and the audience. So I'm not quite used to that yet. So
that's very interesting you say that. I played saxophone for a while, and like I almost got a sense like I'd be less nervous. I imagine that the people are staring at the saxophone, like I can blame my mistakes on like this saxophone in front of me. But with poetry, feels like you have this book in your hand. It's very hard to kind of mentally transfer that through the book. Like it still feels like it's aimed at you.
Oh, and a lot of people don't, right? It is just them and their words, right? People memorize it, or some comedians, right? It's just their face.
Yeah. No, it's not something I've become accustomed to. Like one thing I do for fun, and it's kind of a weird hobby. I interview people, and so I publish interviews with essentially people that I find interesting. Like it's a very selfish endeavor, and I dress it up as if it's and it partly is exploring kind of a concept about how narrative structures affect our lives and how it impacts the amount of empathy we have for different people. So I talk to writers and actors and musicians, even a guy who made a movie, and just talk to them. And that's such an easier way for me to express myself, because you're in person talking over a microphone or over the phone, but then the final piece, when it's published, it's nice and tidy and it's edited. You get to curate it a bit at the end, whereas just live on stage, it's a different animal.
Is this a crossover episode?
Crossover.
Is this? Are we in a crossover episode?
I'm interviewing you. Yeah, it could be.
No, I found that really cool.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said for being able to edit it afterwards, or like take that piece of conversation and look at it, and even to look at narrative. So what do you find in the lens of narrative that you really kind of focus on?
One thing I love is the idea that narrative structures like impact our lives in ways that we don't expect. Like you think someone's crafting a story, they have a book, you're being like, it's a very nice way of being manipulated, right? They're taking you through a journey, and even though there's room for people to disagree about what the author means, it's very curated. But in different contexts, that's not the case at all. Like I spent some time talking with Chris Johnston, who's a reporter with Sportsnet. He covers hockey. He's one of those like hockey insider guys. He's always on his BlackBerry.
It's going to get really confusing because we often, or have in the past, talked about a different Chris Johnson on this podcast.
I caught the T there. Chris Johnston is not Chris Johnson. There'll be links to both below.
But I talked to him about the idea of like how narratives impact how we view sports. And there's this whole, I don't know how into hockey you guys are, but there's this whole thing about like analytics versus like old school hockey fans, and who's really right about like what's happening on the ice and that whole thing. And just the idea of how we pigeonhole players to be kind of one-dimensional. And so, this player is good at this thing and that's it. And this player has an attitude because he said this one thing once. And it impacts not only how we see players, but also the game or individual games, or even, whole nationalities of players, because, there's definitely stigma around being a Russian hockey player, especially if you're young. So it colors how we view all sorts of things like sports or music or even the news. Like it's everywhere, and I think that's interesting.
It is kind of interesting how we look at the medium of facts and like numbers and analytics, and we kind of look at the medium of narrative. Because I think of like Colin Kaepernick, Marshawn Lynch. Like you look at football players, it's very similar with. It's mostly about personality. It's mostly about how you see them on the field. Like people don't really talk about numbers as often, and people that do are kind of in a different set of mind. And you'll see during draft picks, everyone's like either floored or completely like let down when someone's not picked for a team. And you look at the numbers, and it's like a completely different story from like why they're really concerned about it. And it's really interesting that you find that hockey as well. Do you talk about hockey often on the podcast, or is this a different project?
So the hockey thing's kind of a new and separate thing, but I did explore sports in a few different ways. Like I talked to Chris from Sportsnet, and there's also a really great up-and-coming hockey mind named Rachel Dowry. Dowry. She's like 20 years old. She works for an OHL team doing like video work. We had a great discussion with her about she's someone that watches hockey in like a completely different way than I do. Like she combs over like every frame to see who's doing what. So she actually knows what she's talking about is basically what that means. So getting her opinion on how we talk about players and how she sees them like in a much more like analytical way, I thought was interesting just because, the way we talk about it, it's often like it goes down to personality. Like we look like a guy like PK Subban, who is a great player, but isn't a robot, basically, and he has personality as character. And people take their perception of him, and then that colors how they view just what he does on the ice.
Yeah, he's the example, right?
Yeah.
NHL, like, he's like the face of like RW and Co's men division. Or whatever.
Yeah.
Like he does a lot. He is that personality.
I actually know his brother. I've been to a few house parties with his younger brother.
There you go.
No way.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Sorry, I wanted to bring this up. We talked about this last time as well. Kitchener-Waterloo, the new quarterly, did a hockey edition.
No way.
Yeah, but they did hockey writing. Last year at Word on the Street, I was gifted this from them. So
That's
if
awesome.
you want to check it out and read it,
That's very cool.
Shout out to the new quarterly.
New quarterly, another one. Yeah.
Fifth plug of the day.
It's just it's just a way to examine like how we think about things isn't always just because of like the facts or if it's a movie or an album, it's not just based on our like sensational interaction with it. We're often sometimes more interested in the story behind it, which I think is interesting. Like with music especially, people are so interested to know who makes the music they like, to the point where people can't have private lives anymore. So to talk about that, I think, like you think music would be a very personal thing, but that's probably just because I listen to it with headphones, like in my room alone, something like that. But people want to know who's making the things they like.
I think one thing that's very interesting about this, and like I think something else in the room for me, is that sports seems so different from art. I think mentally we categorize them. Like one seems just very sectioned off from the other. But it's really cool you kind of bring the intersections between the two as far as creativity, as far as narrative structure about these things. Now, how do you find that for hockey? You said you have a project with hockey you've been working on?
Yeah. So it's just, basically examining, the play of certain hockey teams, and then half of it's jokes. Some of them even land and they're funny. But the idea of like trying to bring everything together, I hope that works. It doesn't necessarily, but the way I tried to do it, at least in the last kind of round of any interviews I did, I got an old friend of mine who's an MFA student out in Alberta. She does these incredible like sculptures. She's really interested in texture as opposed to color. I got her to do the intro piece for it, and she wrote this like really great personal exploration about her relationship to art and narrative, and her being a woman and what that's meant for her art. And then we go straight from that to like an interview with Chris about hockey. I interviewed Jay Ingram, who used to host like Daily Planet. So I talked about science and the art of science writing and things like that. Jesse Andrews, who made the movie Me and Earl and the Dying Girl. Just trying to like cover the spectrum of people's experiences dealing with narrative, even if it's not necessarily a subject matter where you typically think narrative.
So did you say you got to interview the person that worked on Me, Earl, and Dying Girl?
Yeah, so he wrote the book, and then he wrote the screenplay and helped produce the movie. And now he's actually directing a movie based on a David Foster Wallace short story.
My partner's probably kicking herself in the pants. I actually invited her to this. I was like, oh, you should come out. And
I told her.
one of her favorite movies of all
really?
time.
It's a great movie.
It really is.
Great movie. I felt like that was... I sent that interview request, and I sent out tons, and I don't hear back from most people just because I'm just... it's my own platform. It's a website that I started. Nobody's heard of it. And I don't put stuff out all that often. I sent him an interview request, I think in like March of one year. I heard from him in August, and he sent me the nicest, most apologetic emails saying like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm just getting to this. Let's talk. And we talked for maybe an hour or an hour and a half on the phone. I felt like we could have been best friends. Like, just the nicest guy, super smart, and I love his book and the movie. The movie's great.
I will say, like, if you're used to sending that much out there to that big of a name and not hearing back from a lot of people, like, you're gonna love poetry. You're gonna love publishing.
I know. I've tried to publish like short fiction and essays too, and you just never hear back, right?
Yeah.
It's awful.
No, that's the scenario. Are there any short fiction projects you're working on currently?
Or? There's a few things I've got on the stove at the moment. One of which I like to pretend will be a novel at some point. I've started so many novels, and I've even gotten to like the 50 or 60,000 word mark. Never finished.
Really?
Yeah, never. It's never happened for me, either because I feel like I've exhausted the idea, but what I'm left with isn't enough to actually be its own thing, or I think of a better way to approach it and I restart it, and then ad infinitum, right? So I've got, I think I have pieces, some of them significant, of like 3 books lying around somewhere. So I might actually get to that at some point. Hopefully before I die.
3 books. That's the goal before you die?
Well, I want to finish at least one of them.
Yeah, at least one of them.
Yeah.
That's interesting you say that, because I know, for a lot of us, like, you have at least 20 ideas on the go. You have a stovetop kind of idea. How would you say your process is as far as categorizing these ideas? You kind of said you've exhausted the idea. How would you kind of look at that pursuit of the idea of a story?
And this is probably a reason why I never finish, is because I start with a concept that I find interesting, not necessarily like a character or a setting, but I start with an idea, and then I adapt the characters and the setting to try to explore that idea. And I'm not overly a planner. Like, I know there's kind of that division between people who plan their stories a lot and then people who discover as they go, like discovery writers. I don't know if I can neatly fit into either, because I don't have like a strong philosophy one way or the other. I just kind of, here's a concept, I want to explore it. And I sometimes even make the mistake of trying to name it too early, which kind of corners where your story can go, and then you just kind of fizzle out. But it's definitely more concept driven than anything else, which means it's also less substantial, which means it's easier to let go.
So how do you make that idea tangible? Do you kind of just write hoping that you'll be able to express this concept more, or do you find you try to plan your way through as far as like, this is the concept I want to do and this is what I'll need to do it in order to do it, or do you kind of just have a general start and then you work your way through the idea?
How it usually works, I have a concept, and just thinking about that over the course of a month or two, you start to picture certain scenes that aren't necessarily all that connected, but you get an idea in your head, you get an image, and you start to develop that scene and then extrapolate, and hopefully the two are as connected as you think they are, at least in your head. So for example, I had this idea, and this is very much related to my own existential anxiety of like, what am I going to do with my life? This idea of a room somewhere where you go in the room and you decide there's something you want to do with your life. You want to be really good at playing piano, and you want to be the best person who's ever played piano. And it's a room where you can basically spend years of your life, as in like physically spend, almost like currency, and practice just to get as good as you can at it, except the years of your life are taken off of the end. So you're essentially whittling down, if you would have died at 82, maybe you die at 75, but you get 7 years of experience in this thing, whatever you want to do. And I've tried to explore that idea so many times of like, well, what would people want to do, or what does that room look like, or who knows about this, or like, how do you insert that kind of like supernatural element in the type of fiction that I like to write, which is more kind of like normal literary fiction. Like, how do you try to combine those ideas? And I've gotten pretty far sometimes, but because the idea isn't totally concrete, it's easy to slip through your fingers.
Now, how do you find, like, that's a really compelling idea. I love it. How do you find inserting a character into that?
Well, I mean, first of all, like I said, sometimes my characters tend to be a little too much like me, which means that they lead, very quiet lives. Their internal lives are a lot like mine. I try to start with pictures, which doesn't always work, but I troll Google Images for pictures of people with interesting faces. And
Is that the exact search tagline? Is it
Well,
pictures
you know,
of people with interesting faces?
there might be a spreadsheet of key terms or something. And I take the pictures and then I actually hand draw them, turn them into like little caricatures, and I have a board in my room and I just pin them up, and then from their face, of course your personality is determined by your looks, right? so I start to develop backstories and names, and that kind of helps compound the original scenes that I've put together, and then we're off to the races. So it's kind of developed. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you say it out loud. It's just kind of a collection of weird methods that I've developed over the years that gets me pretty far, but hasn't yet gotten me to the end.
I don't think it's weird for a lot of people. I think talk about process can be a very difficult part for a lot of writers, because sometimes you ask them about it, and it's like, it's so hard to explain this. It's a very deeply intimate and personal process when you are writing, and the way you choose to do that. We appreciate you sharing with us. Is there anything else as far as like, how long does it generally take you to write a piece? Because I think In Absentia was what you read at the reading series.
Yeah.
How long did that one take?
Well, I actually pulled that. That was a scene or a chapter from one of the many novel projects that's sitting in a drawer somewhere. For that scene, that, you know, it really depends on how strong the image is in my head. I guess I'm a visual thinker, or like I like to relate ideas to images, so I start with the picture and then kind of go from there. So I think the imagery there was of a person doing kind of what I used to do as a kid, which was listening to static on the airwaves. So when I was a kid, I used to want to be a rock star. So of course I bought like a really terrible Les Paul electric guitar, plugged it into like a $30 amp, and just like boosted up the gain to try to get like a distortion without actually having to buy a distortion pedal. And when you do that on like a really terrible amp, you get all sorts of like radio signals coming in and out. And when I realized I wasn't going to be a rock star, I used to just do that and then listen to whatever came through the airwaves, because I was really intrigued by like where that came from. I used to kind of think it might be, you know, like supernatural or something like that when I was really young. So that's kind of an image that I took and tried to transplant into someone else's life, and then figure out from there. So that I couldn't tell you how long that took, but to go from, you know, memory to image to fiction, you know, that could be, you know, if it's a really good image and I feel really strongly, it could be, you know, 2 hours, or it could be, you know, 2 months or something. It really depends.
I do like the connection you drew to memory there, because before it's just an image, but like I can remember the exact experience. Like my mom forced me to learn piano for 2 years, and I wasn't very good at it, but I had one of those Yamaha electrics, and like I would just like press the keys and like turn up the volume, or like pick one of those weird synths, and then just, because I was not good at it, I would just like immerse myself in the noise of it and just kind of get used to like that droning. And I think when you relate to a memory like that, I think people can relate to that. People can remember hearing a strange noise, or sometimes you're forced to listen to a loud noise for a long time. You kind of get into the trance of it. I think that makes the poem more relatable, and I think the image gets a little bit more clear for everyone when you do that sort of thing.
Yeah. No, memory triggers, like a lot of things, it triggers even like an emotional state, which if you're writing hopefully character-driven, you know, literary fiction, it's about exploring those emotions, right? Which is probably why a lot of my characters, at least on first draft, sound like me, is because it's coming from images that are derived from memory, which cause emotions to kind of bubble back up. And it also doesn't help that at various times I've used writing as a form of therapy, basically. Like that idea of a room where you literally spend years of your life, that's like a very obvious, like thinly veiled look at, like, well, what am I doing with my life? And what am I spending years of my life, even if it looks differently, doing? And is it worthwhile? Am I, you know, being validated? Is it, like, do I feel good about it? So that's all coming from that sort of place, and you know that's the concept that I'm trying to explore. So a little bit of me, you know, bleeds in.
That's really cool. I know it's like to kind of put yourself into a work like that and really feel that existential angst in a piece. What is it like to perform that kind of thing? I don't know if you've done it yet, but what do you imagine that to be like when you perform something that's so close and so intimate to you?
It's really exciting, and I say that as an introvert. Like I like public speaking. I like doing podcasts, but you're in control in those situations, and especially on a podcast, you're sitting in front of a microphone. Sometimes the other person's in a different room or a different country. You have that kind of distance that you need to really open up without being self-conscious at all. Performing fiction live in front of an audience, the feedback is much more immediate, even in terms of body language. Maybe people aren't even looking, or they're starting to fidget because, it's just not quite doing it for them. And that's also a big consideration for literary fiction because, first of all, not everyone likes that genre, if you can call it that. But also the styles are very particular to each author. Like in that genre, you can basically do, almost anything you want for artistic purposes, and as long as it works, it works. So people's tastes change, and what's interesting to me might not be interesting to them. And so if it's a story that's designed to fulfill my own creativity and curiosity, you can't really bank on it being, for everybody.
So you also run a podcast. How do you find the art of interviewing, if it is doing art?
So we've only recently done like audio stuff, and before then I recorded audio and then transcribed it because it's taken me a long time to be okay with the sound of my voice, but also, people hum and haw, and it isn't always comfortable. Like I've had some interviews where, like Jesse Andrews, I felt like we could have been best friends. I felt like I actually kind of wanted to be his best friend too, which was really sad when we don't talk anymore. But the art of actually trying to like pull out information, I think is actually really difficult. And I've had some like really big successes and some like very big failures. So I've hopefully learned from the failures, and that helps me kind of keep the information flowing, keep the other person comfortable, but also because it's like a very selfish endeavor to satisfy my own curiosity, I'm trying to get something out of it in terms of discussing a specific aspect related to whatever they do. So sometimes it takes a while to kind of get there.
Mm-hmm. No, I can definitely tell that as a person currently interviewing you on a podcast. Shout out to Jesse Andrews. Please call us back.
Yeah.
No, but there definitely is there's kind of an aspect of you feel like you're interviewing someone and there's almost a responsibility to engage with their subject matter rather than to bring your own into it. And it does kind of create this awkward medium where it's not just your own pen on it, it's not just your own color on it. You need to let what is already there or what is already part of that medium become part of the interview.
Yeah.
How have you kind of dealt with that as far as that connection between you and the other?
Well, first of all, I only interview people whose work I find interesting. Like I'm not doing this for money. In fact, it's like a net negative. It's tough out there. But I also like pick people very specifically because their book spoke to me, their movie spoke to me. I've listened to their album 1,000 times, or like for example, I interviewed Alan Cross, if you know him. He's a Toronto radio guy. Yeah. He does a show called The Ongoing History of New Music. Yes. He's on The Edge. Yes. I think he was on Indie 88 for a while.
But they broadcast that like nationwide.
Yeah, he's all over the place, and it's Canada's longest running radio show about music specifically, I think. And he's a guy who can tell stories about like literally anyone. Like the amount of names that guy can drop is like astounding. Like in one conversation, we went from talking about what Slash is like in person and Axl Rose to like Mariah Carey and John Frusciante from like the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Like he's just like name dropping like nobody's business. So for some people, it's very easy to pull out that kind of really interesting, engaging thing because he's obviously really into that. Whereas sometimes people who write books, or in my experience, people who write music aren't necessarily as open to talking about process, like you said, because it's very personal. Or sometimes it's something that you do without thinking. Like some people are just able to create something without a lot of thought, which means I probably hate them because I have to think about it so much to do it. But some people are just like energized by that, and it's really easy to pull out kind of the conversation space that you want. And then some people, it's like pulling teeth.
I think with process, it's a very difficult thing to talk about because sometimes we almost want our art without looking behind the scenes. It's like me. Like sometimes you look at a poem, it'd be very good. I remember this in Ottawa. I looked at a poem, it was very good. I didn't get it, and I was curious enough, and I was at a party and I asked him like, hey, like, so like what is going on here? Like, because I actually don't know. And when they came on very earnestly and very honestly, like they let me know what the poem was actually about, and I was like, yeah, I didn't get that. And I asked like the other editors of Inwards at the time, I was like, it's like, did you get that out of this? They're like, oh yeah, no, I have no idea what it's about. I'm like, it's like we all yes this, we all love this. Did any of us actually get it? Does anyone actually get this? And like approaching poetry or anything else from that, I think poetry almost has an ulterior motive in kind of hiding its process. And poetry is one of those mediums that can really be focused on hiding what its process is. It's so hard to talk about what are you actually trying to say. Like let's not make it discreet. Like, what are you actually trying to communicate here? What made you want to communicate that? What happened?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's very hard. And even with interviews, like sometimes talking about opinions or ideas you have and where did that idea come from? Where did that opinion come from?
Yeah.
Can be even harder.
And sometimes you piss them off too. Like one of the first ones I did, the first series I did, I called Spotlight, which is a very uninspired name, very overdone. And but it basically communicated that these are people that I really enjoy. I think other people would enjoy. Let's talk to them about their work. Like very basic stuff. Mm-hmm. And I talked to this one lady who's a great author. Her name's Mary Doria Russell. She writes kind of literary fiction, but the book that really spoke to me was actually science fiction, kind of a science fiction book. It dealt with issues of faith, and it was about, and this sounds weird, but it's actually an incredibly beautiful book. It's about a Catholic priest who ends up going on the first expedition to another planet to meet an alien race, and the only evidence they have of the aliens is this beautiful music that gets picked up by satellites. And so he's a guy who's really into music and language, so he goes. It sounds weird, but it's incredibly touching. The book's called The Sparrow. So I contacted her because I've just read this book. It's fresh in my mind. It really spoke to me especially because of the elements of faith. Like, it was very powerful. And I start saying, like, I really want to talk to you about your books and your work. I find it really engaging. The voice of her characters I thought was very unique. And I had to get through her agent and her manager, and you have to get through some gatekeepers just to get to her. Mm. Finally get a hold of her. We sit down and we email back and forth, and that's how we do the interview, just over correspondence. And 3 of the first 4 questions I ask are about The Sparrow, because that's the book that speaks to me. I wasn't thinking that The Sparrow was published in like 1994. She's been writing for like an additional 20 years. She doesn't want to talk about The Sparrow. And so she's very polite. She answers the questions. She says, well, this question was kind of answered in this place that she published. You can use that, and just, that's my answer. And so I go, okay, like we were going to do maybe 2 or 3 rounds of questions. Send her another round of questions, and probably 2 out of 4 of those were about The Sparrow. And she just loses it. Because, of course, like, that was one of her first big hits, like the first one that hit the bestsellers list. And she's never achieved the same commercial success as when she published The Sparrow. So for 20 years, she's been trying to follow that up with books that probably to her mean just as much as The Sparrow, but haven't had the same commercial success. Right. And here I am, a kid, doing a glorified book report, asking her about this, and she's spending her off time and understandably upset. And that experience horrified me, because that's very clearly me coming in with an agenda that's specific to a way that they're not interested in. Like, she doesn't want to talk about that. She's got 2 more books on the way. She's published probably like 6 in between there. There's a lot more to talk about, and she's a much more diverse author than just that one book. So I learned very quickly that you can't be that specific in what you want out of it, because most people don't want to talk about that one thing that you want to talk about. You have to approach it in a much more generous and curious way, so that the response is actually engaging, because if people are actually engaged and curious, you're going to get a much better conversation than if you're asking them about a book they wrote 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely been a learning process, because if you don't do it well, the end product's going to be bad. You're going to have a bad relationship with them, and then it's going to haunt your dreams for the next 6 months. So I hear.
So I hear. So you've had some pretty big names on your podcast before. Before we were talking about Infinite Jest, anything on that? Yeah.
So I have a few connections to... This sounds so lame when I say a few connections to David Foster Wallace. Clarify, never met the guy. He had no idea who I was when he died. It took me a long time to get through his books, so I'm sure I actually don't even understand them. But
none of us do. Let's just face it.
Yeah, that's probably the case. I got to interview 2 people who were kind of closely related to him, at least in like a professional sense. I interviewed a guy who wrote his biography after he passed away, and the guy who narrates most of his audiobooks. The guy who does his biography, his name's D.T. Max. he wrote the biography. I think it was called "Every Love Story is a Ghost Story," and he also writes for the New Yorker. That's what he does full time. And I harassed this guy for probably 3 months to try to convince him to talk to me, and it takes that long because I'm not a big name. Nobody really reads my stuff. It's mostly for personal interest, even if the website looks a little nicer than most people's, just like personal blogs.
Can we get the actual information for that website? Because I think we've got to plug it at some point.
Sure. Yeah, it's
Plugged a lot of people.
it's softcover.ca.
That's softcover.ca for all of you. Softcover.ca. We'll have a link below.
Does not get updated all that often, but I'm sitting on a few interviews right now. But I talked to DT Max, and I was thrilled because, first of all, he was like one of the biggest names I talked to so far. Like he writes for the New Yorker. He wrote this great book about David Foster Wallace. So 3 months go by, he finally agrees to do it. I schedule a time, and at the time I was going to law school in Kingston at Queens, and I was driving back to Oakville to do the interview, but also just to be home for the weekend. And of course, it's the 401, so there's traffic, and I get stuck, and it takes about twice as long as it should. And I end up looking at the time, and the whole time I'm just like sweating through my clothes because I need to talk to this guy because I don't want to spend another 3 months trying to schedule something. So I end up pulling over in Scarborough in the middle of a thunderstorm in the parking lot of a Chinese grocery store just to have a spot that's hopefully remotely quiet to talk to him over the phone. And it's raining, and I drive like a really terrible car, so you can hear each raindrop hit like the tin can roof, basically. And like TTC buses are whizzing by, and it's very obvious I'm not in a quiet space. So we end up talking for like an hour or like maybe an hour and a half. It's really engaging because, first of all, we're talking about David Foster Wallace, who's like a very big literary figure, even if he's kind of controversial in that a lot of people talk about him, not a lot of people read him anymore. But also his whole approach about how you're supposed to summarize someone's life, and like how biography is like a really awkward way to tell a story because there's objective facts, but you also need to tell a story of kind of the...
It's like you were saying before, like there's narrative in
there's a narrative arc when there isn't necessarily one real narrative arc in our lives, right? Like, I know my life at least is a lot more complicated and also a lot more boring than David Foster Wallace. So we talk, and it's really engaging, and he's talking about his work, his personal fiction, and we wrap, and I finally make it home to Oakville after like 8 hours total of travel time. And one thing I do, and I know it's fairly normal, send people the transcript before I publish because, first of all, I'm a nobody and I want to make sure they're comfortable. And second, I'm also a huge people pleaser, so it gives me anxiety if I put something out there and somebody doesn't like it.
Oh no, that's like exactly what this is.
Yeah. So it's tough, right? Because that's someone's reputation, and not that his reputation is going to be made or broken based on my blog. But people care about it, especially someone who works at the New Yorker. Like he's a big literary guy. So I send it to him, and 2 hours later he sends me back an email, and I don't want to say pissed off because it got there. Yeah, he's confused because he feels like it doesn't really sound like him. It doesn't sound like things he would have said. Didn't understand some of the questions. And if you ever transcribe audio into text, sometimes some of the tone is missing, and it's a little harder to follow along. So we kind of talk it through, and I say, well, this is what happened. Here's kind of the general arc of the conversation. Here's the audio if you want, just to make sure that like I'm not putting words in your mouth. This goes on for like 2 months, and eventually, like I just don't hear from him. Like I just stop hearing from him. I got ghosted by DT Max basically. And
we can bleep the name of it if you want.
I was going to say
DT Max. He did it. Shout out to DT Max.
I was like, we'll just shout him out.
Don't tag him.
The man that wrote the book, the man that wrote the story, All Relationships Are Ghost Stories, ghosted someone.
So, like, I felt like, what are you supposed to do? Because I'm fairly sure, like, you're allowed to publish at that point. Like, you don't need to give someone the chance to comment on the story before it goes out, right? Like, it's on the record. I'm not making it up. I have the proof. You can put it out there, except I'm too awkward or scared or too much of a people pleaser to do that. So I don't. And so I published the rest of the interviews. I think like a year and a half later, I do a second series that's hopefully a little more refined and less specific to my tastes. And so I figure, well, we had a good conversation, and enough time has passed that he probably isn't angry anymore. So I email him again, and I finally get a hold of him, and I say, well, a year and a half ago we had this conversation. I don't know if you remember me. Here's the transcript. I was hoping to publish it in this next set. And essentially the same thing happens again. So to this day, I think I recorded that interview like 3.5 years ago. I've never published it, and nobody's ever seen it, and it still like occupies a significant portion of my anxiety at this point, because like what am I gonna do?
Yeah.
So it doesn't always work. It's just an awkward thing doing interviews, because you never know how it's going to be received or if your intention really comes across.
In a professional position like he's in, there of course is an anxiety now about every level of media or journalism that's going on around you, because the smallest person can happen to just link up with the right social media connections, and that one interview with the smallest person can have the biggest effects.
Or
which has not really been the case in the past. Like 20 years ago, we could have it with some small person. They'd publish it in a university magazine. Nobody would ever hear it.
Yeah.
It's a different world now. Cliche.
Yeah. I think what's crazy about it is that it's like sometimes you don't even need, like, you can just be shared a lot. Like sometimes like a Tumblr post or like a Twitter post will just get viral, and then like everyone knows about this now, and it's now public information. And it's crazy how journalism just kind of changed like that, or information's kind of changed like that. We're back in studio with Slackcast at Evan's apartment with Duncan Field, Jess Crawford, Evan Hoskins, and myself, Drew Douglas.
And Kara.
And Kara.
Yeah.
Buddy's having a nap.
In some ways celebrating the word nostril. And the prompt of the week is nostril. Duncan, why don't you go first?
Sorry, first, why nostril? This is super strange. Elbows was strange enough with AJ before.
I always try to make one of my prompts a body part.
Oh, there you go.
And subconsciously, I try to aim for eye level, and then sometimes with people, like, eye level's too much for people, so I like go a little bit lower, and I look at their nostrils, and
Right.
I'll say it, you got good nostrils.
I've heard that before, so it's good.
Link below to Duncan's nostrils.
Shout out to Duncan's nostrils. I'm going first?
You are?
All right.
Yeah.
If you so choose.
Should I preface this, or should I just...
Whatever.
Yeah.
Just going raw.
Going to. All right. Nostrils. We sat down, one across from the other, me dressed in my Sunday best. I looked at the floor, more out of embarrassment than anything else. The church bell rang at the top of the hour. It rang 3 times. The preacher reached across and touched my hand. "It's okay, son. Whatever it is, you can tell me." I slowly lifted my gaze, felt my face redden. The chairs creaked. He shifted, and I saw his feet, his trousers, the plain white polo that was the uniform of the middle-aged at the congregation. He wore a cross around his neck, and it hung in precarious space as he leaned forward. His face. I could not look away from his face. It was round and paternal and bearded. On it, I could see his nostril and the evidence of a pizza dinner that rested there, sitting surely in his field of vision. How could he not see it or feel it burning a hole in his skin? How does someone so messily eat something like food or a lasagna and not feel it on their nose at the top of it? How does it not spill onto a perfectly white, perpetually crisp and ironed suburban polo? How is a man supposed to confess his sins, his daily greatest shame, when a goddamn lasagna or piece of tomato sits there like that? How the hell is a man supposed to admit to stealing, then returning a bag of chips from the store like a 12-year-old boy, and then ultimately stealing it again to stay committed to something for once in his life? "You know what, Father?" I said. "Maybe another time."
That was great.
I really like that.
Yeah.
It almost stuck out. I mean, there's a really sincere moment I really liked in there where you mentioned the stealing the potato chips. And it seems like it's such a comedic piece, and then you just kind of pop it in there and you return back to the comedy. So much like it shakes you out of it, and then it just kind of goes back, and you're kind of stuck like thinking about it, but not really having to engage with it.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's comedic writing.
Yeah, I have a lot of fun doing it, and like obviously in a setting like this, you're not writing War and Peace in 15 minutes. And
You should see what I did.
I saw what you did. I know you didn't write War and Peace. It's so tough to balance, especially like if I'm trying to throw in a joke or two in there. like the whole like show don't tell. Like there are certain cases where you just can't do that, and especially if you're trying to throw in jokes, especially in like a really tight space. Sometimes it's worth it just to do a bit of like exposition, especially. And this is, you know, my character's coming back to me again. Like anxious, overthinking, overanalyzing inner dialogue. I have a lot of fun with that. So.
Yeah. I think sometimes you can asparage that character voice of like, oh, it sounds so to me. I think they're like, I wasn't necessarily thinking about it just as you, but I have you reading it, so it kind of makes that other spirit. It's good. It's solid, and I don't think reading that character necessarily needs to flee from being you, and I think it comes from a very authentic voice. And because it's focused on another, and focused on experiences of others, it manages to do quite a lot. And I'd say, if anything, try not to flee from the personal voice that comes out in that text.
And for the record, I've never stolen chips, so totally fiction.
I come from a different experience of the world that does not relate to writing in most ways. And I noticed two things. Number one, you mentioned the word Redden, and to me, I immediately thought of Wade Redden, and I was like, you are a true Sens fan, and you didn't even know it.
I love it.
Yes, so I was just like, oh, shut up. Second thing is, you were talking about, like, maybe it was pizza or lasagna, and I was like, I understand pizza, but who eats lasagna so messily? Of course, that would be me. But I thought it was great. I thought it was really funny.
Well, thank you.
I enjoyed it.
That's fine.
Another thing that kind of came out of that is, I noticed you focus a lot on the setting of the person, like the description of their clothes, their face, their body, which is necessary for what the actual mechanic of the story is going to do. But I feel like setting was kind of missing from the piece. Like, we're in a church, we're kind of like at a church, somewhere in the church, and then from there it kind of takes on the two figures, and it kind of, the room kind of disappears from view for a while. I'd say if you wanted to, you could kind of flesh that out more and bring out the either confession booth setting of it or something like that.
Yeah. True. That's one of those cheap tricks I try to get away with, because, like, obviously in this setting, it's more of like a confessional thing. And I didn't grow up Catholic, so I have no idea what a confession booth looks like other than like in the movies. So try to slip in something that you don't quite know enough about, and try to slip it through as a kind of a vague reference, and hope it sticks.
There you go. Confessionals.
Yeah.
Foucault.
That's probably the first time I've given someone an actual criticism.
I love it. I love it.
A workshop.
That's awesome.
It's hard. It's not easy.
Yeah.
I encourage you to just say like hurtful things that don't have any basis to me.
Like very personal things.
Yeah,
like
things like,
deep-seated.
I just don't think you're a good person or a lover, and like that's a better criticism.
Like, your pants are wet hanging in my bathroom right now, and your sock was seeping into the sink.
This is in the sink.
It was. I had to move it. I had to touch your wet sock.
See that
That kind of
works.
criticism?
Yeah.
That's the kind of criticism
Yeah.
that I really need. I am
Digs deep in there.
Why did I take my socks?
What do you got, Crawford?
I don't know if there's any.
Go
sort
check
of,
on it.
I don't know if there's any sort of rules to this.
No, none.
But I called it Nose Thrills. I'll just wait till he comes back. It sounded really intense.
Cut it out of the post.
He's plunging in there.
Yeah, what are you doing?
Why did I flush my shirt?
I said that I called this Nose Thrills.
Nose thrills.
Yeah. This is sort of, I'll preface it with the fact that in my first year of nursing school, we had a test, and we had to train for a bunch of different assessments, one of them being assessing the nose. And that was the one I ended up choosing out of the hat that I had to perform. And I, aced it, but it was just such a strange thing. And you're, shaking trying to perform this in your, first year. So this is my sort of, play on that. Nose thrills. Your nares are equal and structurally sound. No deviated septum noted. Caesalbax plexus, cilia, meatus, tip to bridge, all in good spirits. Your nose is a perfectly cute triangle. I'd like to know, have you experienced any epistaxis? Well, yes, I paid mine last spring too. But I mean nosebleeds. Have you had any of those? No? Okay, very well. What about rhinorrhea? No, that term does not refer to your past burrito washroom endeavors. It means runny nose.
That's so good.
That's nose thrills.
Yeah, impressive.
Thanks.
Very impressive. I love any time a poet or a writer pulls in their other community, their other niches, like someone who knows like hockey lingo or wrestling, as we were talking about earlier, and makes that a poem. But I've heard a few people who come from the medical field or the science field and will write with that terminology just because of, it's in their daily life, but there's also so many unique words that they have access to. And I often think that about what you're doing day to day, and there's a poem right there that's pulling those words. And it's fascinating because when you don't know those words, of course you have associations with their Latin origins and their pieces. Like rhinorrhea is a beautiful word that I doubt many people know. Fits in this nostril
What does it sound?
discussion.
Like the only other rhea word people know is diarrhea.
Yeah.
Or gonorrhea.
Some
people know that. I don't know.
Yeah.
No,
I think rhyme makes me think of nose. Is it like a running of the nose?
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Latin. Thank you, Latin. I would say one really cool thing about that is I think this time there's a little bit of awkwardness just because there's complex words in there, but you got a lot of room for really good sound poetry with that one because once you've gotten a few.
I was thinking about my sound poetry. I try and think of my assessments as sound poetry. I sometimes sing.
Yeah, at the hospital.
Yeah.
Right on.
It's true that there's a lot of really pleasing words and sound. I assume that's what sound poetry means. I don't actually know.
Yeah, that was a little
really
high
pleasing
level.
sounds.
A little
Sound poetry
different
just means
from
things.
smell poetry.
It's just where you focus on the intonation of sounds and how sounds themselves can be a poem.
Yeah.
And it's fun stuff.
Totally.
You can search it yourself. Links below to sound poetry, the Wikipedia article. No, but I do think with that one there is with those metaphors. There's a lot of room for the second time through it. Maybe saying it wrong. Maybe saying it more fun. Saying it how you want to say it. You can do a lot with those words and just kind of run your way through it. With a lot more flow.
I didn't read it out loud beforehand, but it was definitely wordy.
Definitely wordy.
Like epitaxis and rhinorrhea are just words that I just know because they're fun and nobody knows what they mean.
Yeah.
But even the beginning stuff, which should be basic English, I just.
There's another type of poetic translation. I think it's called polyphonic translation. Yeah, Latin again, right? Single phoneme translation, which is super fun to do because it's just translating not languages but words for sounds into words.
Interesting.
So you would take that, try to forget meaning, like the symbol behind, or not the symbol, the meaning behind the symbol, and translate it into whatever comes to your mind, or what other common terminology you would use for it. And so words, it's still English to English or Latin to English, but it's changing its form of English. It's fascinating. I think, shout out, David Goldstein did some in his last book. The language poets do it, so it's pretty cool stuff.
Shout out to David Goldstein, link below.
Oh, professor, yeah.
Very cool.
I guess I'm up next.
Yeah, you're going.
We're going clockwise, or counterclockwise. Shout out to Wittershin. Nostril. Your least sharp, most protruded fingernail is entering into a contract. You are age 7, and you get to decide, am I a picker? You get to explore the least or more important orifice. You get to decide there and then to roll with this. Every time you scrape. You remove something false about yourself, but never get to tell anyone else. Your shame will be your ritual baptism. 5 years pass. Part 2. The American Dentistry Association has never been able to find accurate statistics on the percentage of flossers. In every breath, I get to feel you, until touch is a rhythm of air. What an unfortunate thing it is to have to wear your body on your soul, but have no dresser and have no cabinet. Only laundry days. Touching yourself is addictive. I don't mean it that way, but I do. Some people reach age 20 before they've touched the spot behind their spine. Their coccyx, the side of their earlobe. Some people have never touched their nostrils, never picked, even in innocence. What a horrid thing it is to have to learn yourself. To learn it and never stop remembering. Oh, Evan.
Oh, Evan, I didn't know you were recording.
That was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
That's very good.
Yes, absolutely.
I was hoping somebody would go there. I love talking about those types of things. I'm sure the underlying story was about boogers.
Yeah, I mean, like, in some ways it was. I kind of straight up to like, okay, like, I can't, like, out myself on this podcast as a nose picker.
Once again, there's a lot we can talk about your work. This is like a shameless compliment. All the times on this podcast I've heard you write stuff on the fly, I found it fantastic. Like, publishable material. Like, it's always incredible. I haven't heard your last interview with MLA. Shout out to MLA. I'm sure there's something fantastic.
I think it's the same level of quality, minus, like, my personal self-esteem saying these things. Yeah.
No, just the flow of it and, like, the humor while taking it seriously still. Like, that's something I really respect and something I try to do and often fail at. So to be able to do that, like, take that position, I think is, like, very impressive.
It's a hard line for people to write or perform in, is that, like, that medium between... that unknowing line between, like, seriousness and comedy that is not, like, obvious to yourself or the audience. I can't do that.
Can I
say something hurtful?
Yeah.
I hope it's not hurtful.
Please do.
I will say I missed the first sentence, maybe because you were nervous or something, but I didn't catch the first sentence, and I liked the like before the part 2, but I could not follow the words. Not because of the way you were saying them, I just couldn't follow. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be laughing or not. So for me, although you guys think that's really cool, for me it was confusing. Which is not a criticism, it's just like a comment.
Oh, no, definitely. I can see that. I think sometimes I write something and then I kind of go back and I'm like, oh, no, it's just like pivot directions. And you think literally like, oh, yeah, because the audience can stop, they can back themselves up, they can go forward a word. Verbally.
You have a lot of faith in your audience. I don't know if you've seen pictures or people watching poetry, but it's like...
To describe to you what her face looks like, it's...
Insert photo here.
Yeah. I do think I also talk very fast. I may not necessarily be nervous, or maybe I'm just permanently nervous, but yeah, no, I definitely talk fast, and that's one thing I could work on. Yeah.
Mine's in response. My piece is in response to your article, your essay, your piece of fiction, your poem.
The thing that
he just did.
Oh no!
I always write, and you always do visual art, and it's beautiful.
Who's you?
You, Jess Crawford. You always do.
Shout out to Jess
Crawford.
Shout out to Jess Crawford. Link below.
At Slackline already, and it was amazing. One of our first artist, visual artist. Of course, like Slackline's trying to move towards, has always been trying to move towards other arts, specifically right now visual arts, but also like performance art of various kinds, be it comedy or improv or whatnot. And our last show had amazing visual artists who were
beautiful.
All 3 of you were there. It was wonderful. So we're going to try to do more of that. But I think one way we can go into is more like modern performance art as well. I have no idea. I don't know these communities, but it would be fun to get into it. Anyways, mine's not related to that.
Okay, I was going to say, don't consider this very scrubbles.
Very
like modern.
We're going to take a picture of this. This is a nose. This is my performance art piece of the reverse nose pick.
Before I guess,
I'm gonna take a picture. You take a picture of this if you want.
No, I'm gonna have to take a picture of this. Like, that's a necessary portion of this.
It's so in case.
It just looks like a bowl. Like it's giant.
Why don't we go around the table and we each describe what we see?
Yeah, that sounds good.
We'll do some like psychoanalytics stuff.
There's something going on there.
I think the only way to get through this is to look at this object and each describe.
Okay, as well.
I'm obviously going to cut out the parts where we can't stop giggling at the object. So Evan's essentially drawn or built for us a piece of paper that's been converted into a nostril of sorts. It reminds me of Henry Moore's paint or sculptures.
I cannot speak to that.
Link and bio to Henry
Link below to Henry Moore. He's actually my favorite sculptors. He had a long tenure at the AGO. And by tenure, I mean he had his pieces in there. That's not the right art word because I don't know art history. But it has very large obtuse angles, and there's kind of an abstract nature to it that Henry Moore's sculptures did have. Where I know it's a nose because the prop is nostrils, but to look at the object,
Fair.
Does it scream nose necessarily? No, of course not. But also, you look at it and you can't say it's not a nose, and it kind of rides that line between being and not being.
You know what I loved in your last sentence was, does it scream nose? And Jess and I mean this seriously, I guess a month ago we went to the McMichael Gallery, north of town in...
Kleinberg.
What?
Kleinberg.
Just north of Vaughan or whatever it is up there. And they have a collection, if you walk outside in the free part, they have a collection of huge copper sculptures by a Winnipeg sculpture artist by the name, I can't remember. We're going to have to look it up. But there's
We'll do it in post.
Yeah.
I tweeted it.
Yeah, Slackline tweeted these pictures a bunch. But they're beautiful, and they always have one or two humans, in quotes, of huge size, 2 or 3 times the size of an actual human. And the body parts always do something different, right? So the nose will sometimes be a horn, right? Yeah. And so they're taking these what you would consider turn of phrases or kind of cliched parts of culture, like the tanner on the beach, and turning it in, taking what you would think about it and those images and almost even what I would take as text for it or linguistics about it, and turning that into sculpture. And so taking those forms and what you call it and making its arms extreme or its nose extreme and making it not so obviously a human, but it's still acting and symbolizing human in some parts of what that interaction is. They're beautiful pieces.
Speaking to that,
I thought of that for some reason, taking a piece of paper.
No, I do say that because one thing I was noticing, I put it to my face. I feel describing an object, I can give you the picture of it, and we'll give you a picture of it afterwards, but to describe how it's presented as well as part of it, because you took it and you stuck your fingers through the holes. And for me,
I laugh because it looks hilarious.
It does. It looks like, if you guys ever saw Spy Kids 1 and 2,
Buddy.
it was actually just Spy Kids 1, but I don't want to think of Spy Kids 2. The Floof's minions, the thumb boys.
Yeah.
Just the legs sticking out of the nose. But in another sense, looking at an object that is meant to look as a nostril and is kind of larger, as something extends out of it, we don't necessarily... We think of it as an orifice. Things go into a nose, they don't necessarily come out of it. Boogers come out of it. We don't make that visual.
I'll tell you what comes out of noses.
But to see a finger, to see almost an animate, sensory figure come out of it, because fingers almost are a probing object, to see them exit the nose is almost something interesting in and of itself. And to see them kind of wiggle playfully.
I'm also laughing because we're riding this line between being legitimately interested and respectful of art, and then talking about it it not highbrow, but being respectful of it. And then there's the obvious reality and low part of this that it was a
you carved a piece of paper, almost spitefully to make a nose. Yeah,
which, you can't get around how hilarious that is. That is a lot. I mean, while it is funny to do that with paper, we're doing it on paper as well, and writing half the time as well.
But that's the new thing, right? It's
nose papers.
Well, I mean that too. It's coming in style, I'm sure. Next year maybe. But the balance between high culture and what might be called low culture, or it used to be called low culture. Being able to speak to both of those is I think a really common thing now.
Oh, absolutely.
And it makes it we went from discussing within 2 sentences a Canadian sculpture and Spy Kids.
Yeah.
That's the conversation, and I think that's just how it goes.
Absolutely. I have to say, from in academia, at least within the more conscious, the English department academia, at York, which I was just at, that was the conversation all the time. Was there's no proper art or correct art. There's no way that this is supposed to be. This is just one way of having the conversation. Then we can also look at all the other angles of it, indigenous art or dance versus contemporary dance. There's a beauty in all of it, though it may not be comparable. Yeah, I think be able to have the same discussion in the same place, but they're both as important. One is not superior, which is pretty cool.
I think one big problem we also have when we talk about art and register art, it's a distinction about a friend of mine, Sean Reyes, shout out to Sean Reyes, brought up for me is he kind of refers to craft and art as two different things. So for artists, a visual artist especially, craft is how well you are at oil painting, how good your technique is, but art is what you're trying to communicate and how you communicate that and the soul behind your work. And it's a piece of paper that's not even a new piece of paper, it's a used piece of paper that's been taped and cut in a pretty cheap way. Craft-wise, yeah, amateurish, but art-wise, like what you've communicated with this thing is a different register. And I think sometimes we can even look at visual or literary work, and sometimes we'll look at like, oh, like, you know, it's sloppy writing or like the phrases that are, but there's art behind it. Like I've looked at high school writing before that's like, you know, like it's honestly it's pretty shit, but like there's something behind it that it's good. There's something soulful there. And sometimes you look at like someone that's amazing at their craft, like beautifully crafted words, like, and they're not really saying anything. It's like, does it really matter?
Yeah, and I can't get around this idea all the time right now. Is like if you use like slam poetry, for example, the way like often if you looked at that through a poetic lens, an educated quote, whatever that means, poetic lens, oftentimes it doesn't follow poetic rules and it's not following systems. It's really more just like animated prose, but the amount that the crowd is reacting and taking from it and engaging with it is often like way more than a normal poem, let's say, quote again, because who knows what that is. And you have to think like there's something there about communication, right? And you have to take that for its value, that regardless of how poetic this is, this person's communicating it through an art form at a very good rate, better, quote again, hard to say what better is, but better than a normal poet. So yeah, there's something, you have to take that and analyze it as well, like for its value. And like, while this piece of paper is so ridiculous, we've talked about this paper a lot now for some reason, and about all the, its greater issues. Yeah.
May I?
Yeah.
Definitely.
I know you guys are talking a lot about like things. I would like to acknowledge a few things. I would like to say that to me it looks like a shark head coming out of the water.
Like
It also looks like a fry container from McDonald's.
Ooh.
I was thinking of Pope's hat.
Like a fry container, but diapery.
Super diapery. Like this is like a diaper. It also could be a really snazzy, is the word of choice, hat for dogs.
Ooh, yes.
I actually want to talk about the construction of this. Because in elementary school, you build cubes out of paper. And cutting the fucking cubes is hard enough. And you constructed this nose. There are lines you've drawn on it. And, I mean, I'm wondering if there's any artistic ideas behind where you've put the tape specifically. But,
No comment.
I actually, like, the thing about this is that it doesn't look like a nose because noses are all very different. But the construction in itself, I think, is actually quite interesting. Sorry, I was holding on for so long.
Thank you.
I'm done. I can't talk about the nose anymore.
I'll say last note, Duncan, we're going to you. Knock this one home for us.
I love it.
There you have it, folks. Duncan Field loves Nostrils.
Thank you for coming to Toronto.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us. About 50% of this will be missing, so if you're listening to us right now, you can just like message me personally, like send me the full thing, and I'll have to do it. That's just the rules.
Yeah, and for all of you podcast hipsters, you can say that the other half that was cut was actually the better half, and like you'd be into the B-sides of the Slackcast.
The B-sides of Slackline. Duncan, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks
Yeah.
for having me.
Could you once again tell us what the name of your website is?
Sure. So I'm Duncan. I run softcover.ca, which is a glorified personal blog that I use to interview interesting people. So if you like interviews, and I guess like me and Earl and the Dying Girl specifically.
Specifically, Hannah. Specifically.
And if you like weird connections to David Foster Wallace, you're going to like softcover.ca.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Cool.
Evan, Jess, thank you also for joining us and for hosting us here. I'm your host, Drew Douglas. This is the Slackcast.